Welcome to Disaster Tales. No more sleep today, boss. No more sleep today, boss. Good morning, evening to you, boss. This is your brother Disaster on the digital radio station. Today I'm bringing you a very strange story. While searching through the archives, I got goosebumps while watching it, to be honest. Ready? Let's begin. The air down here didn't just smell like death, boss. It smelled like time itself had crawled into the damp seams of the brickwork, laid down, and slowly rotted away beneath 3 generations of spilled formalin, soggy pine wood, and that harsh, medicinal soap the old-timers used to scrub away human grease. Philadelphia was bleeding cold that winter of 1978. Outside, high above the cellar ceiling, 4 inches of gray sludge had frozen solid along the sidewalks of South Street, locking the city in a stiff, silent vice. But down in this sub-basement beneath the funeral home, the frost didn't stay on the glass. It crept right through the mortar, turning the peeling green wall paint into brittle flakes that shed like dead skin every time the heavy freight elevator jolted to a halt 5 floors above us. I sat there on a low, 3-legged wooden stool right in front of the main stainless steel prep table. My spine was hunched over, aching with that dull, deep throbbing that only comes from 5 straight hours of forced precision under bad lighting. The single bulb swinging overhead was a long, dusty neon tube trapped inside a wire cage. It didn't just illuminate the room. It vibrated with a continuous, low-frequency hum, a dry, electric buzz that rattled against the back of your molars like a dentist's drill running on half power. Whir, click, whir. Every few seconds, the ballast would skip a beat, sending a sharp, cold strobe across the polished steel tabletop where my tools were laid out in a neat, symmetrical row. Small hand saws with narrow iron teeth. Short brass tacks with flat, heavy heads. A bucket of dark brown animal hide glue sitting over a tiny kerosene burner, bubbling with a thick, nauseating stench that tasted like boiled hooves and vinegar on the roof of your mouth. My hands were cold. Even inside the thin, powderless rubber gloves, my fingers were stiff, white at the tips, and heavy. In this business, boss, you don't get the clean cases. The uptown parlors get the peaceful old ladies who passed away in their sleep, tucked into silk sheets with their hair neatly brushed and their hands folded over a leather Bible. Down here, in the damp dark beneath the city, we got the violent ends. The factory fires along the Delaware River. The midnight muggings in the alleys behind the rail yards. And the men who met the heavy steel wheels of the Reading Railroad locomotive head-on out in the freezing dark. My job wasn't to fix them so they'd walk again. My job was to make them look complete enough for a closed casket viewing, so their mothers and widows wouldn't have to stare into an empty sleeve or a hollowed-out trouser leg before the dirt was shoveled over the pine. I picked up an iron file from the tray. The sound of the metal scraping against the edge of the steel tray cut through the hum of the neon tube like a sharp knife dragging across frozen tallow. I wasn't alone down there, boss. I was never really alone. Surrounding my small workstation were dozens of wooden limbs hanging from rusted iron hooks jammed into the damp brickwork. Arms carved from heavy yellow pine. Legs sculpted from hardened beeswax and layers of varnish. Hands with jointed fingers that dangled down toward the concrete, swinging just a fraction of an inch whenever the cold cellar draft pushed through the iron coal chute in the far corner. They looked like frozen soldiers waiting for a command that was never going to come. I took a long, slow breath, feeling the frost burn the inside of my nostrils. I looked toward the heavy freight elevator door at the back of the room. The iron cables inside the shaft gave a sudden, long-drawn-out groan, a wet, metallic strain that sounded like a heavy iron chain being dragged across a pile of dry bones. The night shift had officially begun, boss. The elevator cable stopped groaning, boss. It hung there in the shaft, suspended in that thick, stagnant air, leaving behind a silence so absolute and heavy that it felt like diving to the bottom of a frozen quarry with lead weights tied to your ankles. I didn't turn around right away. I kept my eyes fixed on the stainless steel prep table, watching the small bubbles rise and pop in the pot of animal hide glue, releasing a thick, yellowish steam that smelled of scorched bone and old vinegar. Then came the scrape. It wasn't the elevator cable this time. It was iron rollers moving over rusted steel tracks. The heavy freight door at the end of the sub-basement slid open just 6 inches, pushed by an invisible hand from the upper floors, letting in a draft of air so bitter and foul that it made the dust motes spinning under the neon light freeze midair. 2 orderlies had brought him down from the county morgue on 4th Street. They didn't come inside. They never came inside the prep room, boss. They just kicked the heavy gurney through the opening, let it roll across the uneven concrete floor until it slammed hard against the base of my metal table with a dull, echoing thud, and pulled the iron door shut behind them without saying a single word. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt like a vault door sealing shut on an underground tomb. I set the iron file down. The metal scraped against the steel tray with a sharp, piercing shriek. I walked around the side of the prep table, wiping my rubber-gloved hands down the front of my canvas apron, and reached out to pull back the heavy, stained canvas sheet draped over the gurney. The smell hit me before the fabric even cleared his chest. It wasn't just the sweet, cloying reek of formalin and rotting tissue that you get used to after working 5 winters in a Philadelphia basement. It was something much sharper. The metallic, coppery stench of raw engine grease, crushed coal dust, and frozen mud. The man lying on the steel slab was in his mid-40s, built broad through the chest like an iron worker or a freight loader, with a thick beard matted with dried black soot and small fragments of gravel embedded deep into the skin of his jaw. His eyes were half open, glazed over like 2 milk-white glass marbles staring blankly up at the buzzing neon tube, reflecting nothing, recording nothing, dead to the world and everything in it. I checked the intake tag clipped to the zipper of his canvas body bag. Case 409. Arthur Miller. Reading Railroad Yard, Track 4. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, lower body crush. I reached down and gripped the hem of his heavy wool trousers, cutting through the blood-stiffened fabric with a pair of surgical shears until the right leg parted all the way up to the hip. The left leg was untouched, resting heavily against the metal sheet, covered in dark blue denim and thick winter grime. The right leg, however, ended abruptly 6 inches below the groin. A ragged, torn stump of bluish-gray flesh, cased in dried blood and crushed bone fragments that looked like shattered porcelain mixed with gravel. The train wheels hadn't just severed the limb, boss. They had pulverized it, grinding bone and muscle into a wet paste before the winter frost froze the ruined solid against the rails. I stepped back, pulling the wooden supply crate closer to the edge of the table. Inside the crate sat the replacement. A heavy, hand-carved pine prosthesis, crafted in the workshops behind the parish church over 10 years ago, shaped from a block of seasoned yellow pine and coated in 3 thick layers of dark, amber-colored varnish that had yellowed around the peg joint. It was crude, heavy, and built like an old ship's timber, fitted with thick leather shoulder harnesses and a rusted iron hinge at the knee that squeaked every time you bent it. It wasn't meant to look natural. It was just meant to fill out the empty wool trousers so the family wouldn't have to look at a folded-up pant leg when they lowered him into the frozen Philadelphia clay. I picked up the handsaw. The steel blade caught the yellow light of the neon tube, gleaming like a thin strip of silver in the dark. I positioned the wooden stump against the metal tray, lining up the curved pine socket with the patient's mutilated hip, and began to cut. The saw didn't cut through the pine the way it was supposed to, boss. Instead of sliding smoothly through the seasoned grain of the yellow wood, the iron teeth caught on something hard and dense buried deep inside the core of the timber, something dark and resinous that smelled faintly of old turpentine and burnt sugar, tearing jaggedly against an invisible obstruction that ground against the serrated edge with a sickening, metallic screech that tore through my nerves like a rusted blade scraping across exposed bone. Screech, SKRT. The sound filled the sub-basement, a high-pitched, vibrating shriek that bounced off the damp brick walls and set my teeth on edge, sending a cold, electric shock straight up through my forearms while microscopic vibrations rattled my teeth until the fillings in my jaw ached with a dull, throbbing pain that radiated straight down to my spine. I pressed down harder with my right hand, my weight leaning over the stainless steel prep table, sweat starting to bead along my hairline despite the freezing draft blowing in from the coal chute, muscles burning and trembling under the sudden, brutal strain as my knuckles turned stark white against the wooden handle. The metal blade bit deeper into the pine prosthesis, carving out a thin curl of pale wood that dropped onto the table with a dry, clicking sound like a beetle's shell hitting stone. On the steel slab right beside me, the body of Arthur Miller lay entirely still. His milk-white eyes remained fixed on the buzzing neon tube overhead, unblinking, reflecting the erratic strobe of the flickering light as the electrical current stuttered through the old copper wiring in the ceiling, staring blankly into the void with a terrifying, lifeless fixation that seemed to mock my futile efforts. The smell in the room was growing heavier. It wasn't just the vinegar steam rising from the animal hide glue pot anymore. It was the thick, unbearable reek of stagnant river water and coal smoke lifting off the dead man's wool jacket as the ambient temperature in the cellar dropped another few degrees, freezing the condensation on the concrete floor into a thin, slippery glaze of white frost, choking the air with an acrid, suffocating vapor that clung to the back of my throat like a layer of greasy ash. I stopped sawing. I lifted the iron blade away from the wood, letting out a long, ragged breath that hung in the air between us like a puff of cigarette smoke in a dead winter dawn. My hands were shaking inside the thin rubber gloves. Not from the cold, boss. From the silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something heavy to drop from the ceiling, pressing down upon my skull like a tightening iron vise that threatened to squeeze the sanity right out of my brain. I reached into the wooden supply tray and picked up the short, heavy brass tacks. They were cold, greasy with machine oil, and weighed down with a dull, leaden heft that made my fingertips ache. I needed to secure the upper leather socket of the prosthesis to the mutilated hip joint before the glue cooled down and hardened into useless glass. I leaned over the table, bringing my face within inches of the dead man's open, frozen mouth, and positioned the point of the first brass tack against the torn edge of his gray flesh, smelling the dry, embalmed reek of death rising directly from his sunken lips. The flesh didn't feel like human skin anymore, boss. It felt like stiff, dried leather left out in the rain for a month, cold, unyielding, and completely drained of every last drop of living warmth, stiffened into a rigid, petrified armor that resisted the touch with a repulsive, unnatural stubbornness. I raised the small iron mallet, my wrist cocked back, ready to drive the first nail home. The iron mallet felt unusually heavy in my hand that night, boss. It wasn't just the dead weight of the forged head or the smooth, varnished hickory handle that had worn down to a dull polish from years of gripping in the damp chill of the cellar, but a suffocating, gravitational anchor of pure dread that made my wrist throb and my forearm muscles knot into agonizing, burning cramps as if I were hoisting a jagged block of solid lead, tearing violently at my tendons while an icy sweat poured down into my stinging eyes. It was the air itself. It felt thick, sluggish, and heavy, like trying to swing a hammer underwater through a pool of cold liquid lead, choking off my oxygen supply and pressing down on my chest with an oppressive, crushing weight that forced every desperate gasp back down into my burning lungs, suffocating my desperate efforts to draw breath while my ribcage threatened to cave inward from the sheer atmospheric pressure. I held the small brass tack against the torn, gray edge of Arthur Miller's mutilated hip, keeping the sharp point steady with my left thumbnail while my right hand raised the mallet back toward my shoulder, shaking so violently that the cold metal bit rawly into my skin, driving a fresh wave of blinding, white-hot pain straight through my trembling fingertips. The single neon tube overhead gave a long, agonizing whine, asterisk, and dipped into a deep, bruised orange glow before flaring back to its harsh, flickering white. In that split second of stuttering light, the shadows stretching across the brick wall behind the gurney didn't just sit still. They shifted. They lengthened, curling inward like dreadlocked legs of a dying spider trapped inside a jar of formaldehyde, twisting into grotesque, writhing shapes that seemed to bleed out from the masonry and reach out toward my spine with razor-sharp, phantom claws, scraping silently against my nervous system with a malicious, crawling horror. I didn't look up. I couldn't afford to look up, boss. When you're working down here in the dark with a man who met the iron wheels of a freight locomotive, you keep your eyes locked on the task, or the silence starts playing tricks on the back of your skull, whispering vile, mocking obscenities that claw directly at the fragile boundaries of your sanity, peeling away my mental defenses layer by agonizing layer until I felt like my mind was fracturing completely. I brought the mallet down. Clack. The sound was dead, muffled, and entirely wrong. Instead of the sharp, crisp ring of brass driving into seasoned oak and stiffened human muscle, it sounded like a hammer striking a wet sack of wet sand or a thick block of frozen meat dropped onto a stone floor, shattering the bone beneath with a sickening, wet crunch that echoed inside my skull like a gunshot, sending shockwaves of agonizing vibration through the marrow of my arms. The brass tack didn't sink into the flesh. It bounced sideways, spinning across the stainless steel prep table with a faint, metallic ping that echoed off the damp brickwork like a church bell ringing in an empty graveyard, leaving a spray of dark, congealed tissue splattering against my trembling knuckles with a revolting, sticky warmth. I froze, my hand still raised in the air, the mallet hovering inches above the dead man's torn hip. My breath caught in my throat, dry and sharp as a razor blade, tearing open my windpipe in a silent, suffocating panic that left me choking on my own frantic saliva, pinned under a weight of absolute terror that paralyzed every single muscle fiber in my body. On the steel slab, Arthur Miller's body didn't move. Not yet. But the heavy, hand-carved pine prosthesis, the one I had just set down on the edge of the metal table 3 feet away from his hip, shifted. Just a fraction of an inch. A slow, agonizingly deliberate slide across the grease-stained steel, as if an invisible hand had reached up from beneath the table and pulled the heavy wooden timber closer to the edge, leaving a dark, oily smear of animal hide glue and viscous, black blood in its wake, while a low, rattling exhale hissed softly from the corpse's frozen, parted lips, filling the freezing air with the unbearable, rancid stench of the grave. The pine leg didn't stop sliding after that initial inch, boss. It kept moving across the stainless steel prep table with a slow, deliberate, agonizing drag that sounded like dry fingernails scratching against a chalkboard in an empty room, tearing relentlessly at the surface while a foul, viscous film of oily residue bubbled up in its wake with a sickening, wet friction. Scree, SKRT. The heavy wooden timber pulled itself toward the edge of the metal sheet, inch by agonizing inch, leaving behind a thick, smeary track of dark, congealed animal hide glue that looked entirely too much like fresh, drying blood under the flickering, bruised orange glow of the overhead neon tube, pulsing with an unnatural, parasitic vitality that made my stomach violently churn. I didn't step back. My boots felt glued to the damp, freezing concrete floor, locked in place by a sudden, overwhelming surge of cold terror that froze the blood right inside my veins and left my legs feeling like hollow tubes of lead, paralyzed by a crushing, invisible weight that pressed down upon my shoulders until my spine groaned in protest. My eyes were locked entirely on that wooden prosthesis. The iron hinge at the knee, the one I had oiled and tightened less than an hour ago, began to flex. The pin inside the joint clicked softly once. Then twice. Clack, click. The lower half of the wooden leg rose slowly into the air, lifting itself up off the steel surface without any human hand touching it, bending at an unnatural, backward angle that no mechanical hinge was ever engineered to support, tearing its internal screws loose with a sharp, piercing shriek of tortured metal. It hung there suspended in the thick, chemical-laden air of the sub-basement, trembling with a fine, rapid vibration that sent a low, humming resonance through the metal table and straight up into the tips of my fingers, rattling my bones with an electric surge of sheer, unadulterated dread. On the gurney right beside it, the body of Arthur Miller remained flat on its back. His milk-white, glazed eyes were still staring fixedly up at the buzzing fluorescent light, reflecting nothing, recording nothing, completely dead to the world, yet radiating a cold, hateful malice that pierced straight through my soul. And yet, the massive chest beneath the torn wool shirt began to expand. It didn't expand the way a living man's chest moves when he takes a deep, ragged breath of winter air. It rose in a harsh, jerky, mechanical spasm, the dried ribs snapping inward with a loud, wet crunch of splintered bone and torn cartilage that echoed off the low brick ceiling like a pistol shot in a narrow tunnel, shattering the internal cavity into a bloody, mangled ruin of pulverized tissue. A thick, dark bubble of grayish fluid welled up from the corners of the dead man's open, slack jaw, spilling slowly down over his matted, soot-stained beard, dripping drop by heavy drop onto the stainless steel tray with a wet, rhythmic slap, carrying with it microscopic fragments of decaying flesh. Drip, drip, drip. The air in the cellar turned instantly frigid, dropping so fast that my breath billowed out in thick, white clouds of steam, instantly freezing into tiny, glittering crystals against the stubble of my chin while frost bit deeply into the exposed skin of my cheeks like thousands of tiny, poison needles. The smell of old formalin and scorched pine completely vanished, replaced by an overpowering, nauseating stench of iron rust, wet coal dust, and the unmistakable metallic reek of a slaughterhouse floor gone cold after a long night of killing, burning the inside of my nostrils with the sharp, acidic reek of liquefying organs. I wanted to run, boss. I wanted to throw down my iron mallet, turn around, and sprint toward the heavy freight elevator, beating my fists against the iron doors until the night orderlies hauled me up out of this underground tomb, abandoning every shred of dignity just to escape the closing jaws of this nightmare. Instead, my right hand twitched. My fingers, still encased in the thin, powderless rubber gloves, tightened instinctively around the wooden handle of the mallet, my knuckles turning stark white as the wood bit into my cramping palm with a vicious, unyielding pressure. The wooden prosthesis hanging in midair stopped trembling. It turned slowly on its iron pivot, pointing its heavy, hand-carved pine toe directly at my chest, waiting for the next move in a game neither of us had chosen to play, boss, its silent, menacing posture threatening to drive straight through my breastbone and pin my beating heart to the concrete wall behind me. The wooden prosthesis didn't stay suspended in mid-air forever, boss. After what felt like hours of frozen, suffocating silence, while the neon tube overhead hissed and sputtered like a dying fuse, bathing the claustrophobic cellar in a sickly, jaundiced glare, the heavy pine toe dropped with a dull, echoing thud right back onto the stainless steel prep table, sending a jarring shockwave straight up through my forearms. It didn't roll. It didn't slide. It landed square and heavy, pointing its carved wooden sole directly at the center of my chest, resting just inches away from where my fingers were still clamped around the handle of the iron mallet, glowing with an ominous, suffocating malice that seemed to leach the remaining heat right out of the surrounding air. I didn't move a muscle. My breath was trapped deep in my lungs, burning against my ribs like swallowed embers, refusing to rise or fall, leaving my chest locked in a rigid, agonizing spasm of absolute paralysis. And then, down on the gurney, the dead man made a sound. It wasn't a gasp. It wasn't a groan of pain or a breath of returning life. It was the dry, scraping sound of coarse sandpaper dragging over a block of seasoned pine, coming straight from the back of Arthur Miller's slack, soot-caked throat, carrying with it the sickening reek of putrefying tissue and stagnant graveyard mud. Asterisk H. KKKKK, asterisk. The milk-white, glazed eyes didn't change. They didn't blink. They remained fixed on the buzzing light above us, completely dead, completely empty, like two glass marbles pressed into rotting clay, radiating an abyssal, hateful emptiness that pierced straight through my sanity. And yet, the head began to turn. It didn't turn smoothly the way a living man looks over his shoulder to check a noise in the dark. It moved in a harsh, violent, stuttering series of sharp jerks, the cervical vertebrae grinding together inside the flesh with a succession of loud, cracking pops that sounded like dry pine kindling snapping under the heel of a heavy boot, tearing internal muscle fibers with a wet, sickening rip. Crack, snap, crunch. With every brutal twist of the neck, the skin along the side of his jaw stretched tighter and tighter over the bone until it looked like pale, translucent parchment paper about to split right down the middle under the pressure, leaking tiny beads of dark, congealed gore along the taut seams. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy, bearded face rotated all the way around until it was facing me directly across the narrow stainless steel table, defying every known law of anatomy and biological limit. The jaw hung loose, unhinged and slack, dripping that thick, dark, grayish fluid down over his torn collar and onto the cold metal slab in a steady, rhythmic stream, hissing softly against the freezing steel. And then, out of that ruined, silent mouth, a voice came scraping out. It wasn't coming from the room around us, boss. It didn't echo off the damp brick walls or bounce against the low concrete ceiling. It was echoing directly inside the marrow of my own skull, bouncing off the inside of my forehead like a heavy iron ball rolling across wooden floorboards in the dead of night, drilling microscopic shards of pure terror straight into my cerebral cortex. "You missed a spot with the glue, boss," the voice rasped, dry and grating, smelling of old coal smoke and frozen river mud, vibrating so violently against my eardrums that hot blood began to trickle from the left side of my nose. My knees gave out beneath me, the strength draining entirely from my legs as I stumbled half a step backward, my boots slipping on the layer of white frost forming over the concrete floor, sending a sharp wave of agonizing cramps through my lower limbs. I slammed hard against the wooden supply crate behind me, knocking a dozen wooden fingers and wax toes clattering onto the ground in a frantic, rolling cascade of dry, hollow taps that echoed off the masonry like the bones of a skeleton hitting a tomb floor. On the table, Arthur Miller didn't smile. He didn't have the muscles for it anymore. He just raised his right arm, the one that had been resting lifelessly at his side for 5 hours, with a slow, torturous creak of dried joints, and pointed a stiff, gray, frost-bitten finger straight at the open, waiting iron door of the freight elevator across the dark cellar, "Boss," beckoning me toward a fate far more absolute than death itself. The finger didn't waver, boss. It stayed pointed straight out toward the dark, recessed mouth of the freight elevator at the far end of the sub-basement, rigid and stiff as a rusted iron spike driven deep into a frozen oak post, vibrating with an unnatural, electrical tremor that sent invisible shock waves ripping through the freezing air. The pale, translucent skin along the dead man's wrist was pulled so tight over the bone that I could see the dark, frozen veins beneath it, standing out like swollen black cords against the gray pallor of his flesh, threatening to rupture and spray dark, congealed gore at any second. My spine was pressed hard against the splintered pine of the supply crate behind me, the sharp edges digging painfully through the thick fabric of my canvas apron and biting straight into my lower back, piercing the flesh with a hot, stinging agony that barely registered beneath the numbing wave of pure terror. I couldn't draw a full breath. The air in the cellar had grown so cold, so thick with the chemical reek of formalin and wet coal dust, that every attempt to fill my lungs felt like inhaling tiny, microscopic shards of broken glass, tearing my windpipe apart from the inside out while my chest muscles knotted into agonizing, immovable cramps. An erratic mechanical stuttering tore through the overhead fixture, dying down to a dim, sickly amber glow that barely reached the corners of the room before flashing back into a harsh, blinding white light, searing my retinas with an erratic, strobe-like violence. In that sudden flash of illumination, I saw them. The dozens of prosthetic arms, hands, and wooden legs hanging from the rusted iron hooks along the damp brick walls weren't hanging still anymore. They were swaying. Not from the draft. Not from the wind blowing down through the coal chute in the corner. They were swaying in perfect, rhythmic unison, swinging back and forth like the pendulums of a dozen dead clocks ticking down the final seconds of a very long, very quiet night, fueled by a malignant, invisible force that defied every law of nature. A dry, hollow rattling filled the space between us as the jointed wooden fingers brushed against each other, sounding like 1,000 beetles crawling behind the rotting wallpaper of an abandoned asylum, scratching frantically to get out into the open air. On the stainless steel prep table, Arthur Miller didn't lower his arm. His milk-white, glazed eyes remained locked onto mine, unblinking, reflecting the erratic strobe of the flickering fluorescent light without a single flicker of life, yet teeming with a dark, heavy malice that felt older than the city itself, a bottomless abyss of pure, unadulterated hatred. And then, slowly, the heavy gurney beneath him began to move. It didn't roll smoothly across the concrete floor. The metal wheels caught on a patch of black ice near the drain, producing a high-pitched, vibrating wail against the stone that set my teeth on edge and made the fillings in my jaw ache with a sudden, throbbing pain, driving jagged needles deep into the quivering roots of my gums. The harsh, piercing screech of grinding metal echoed through the chamber as the gurney slid forward 2 inches. Then 4 inches. Closing the distance between the far corner and my workstation, sliding right across the puddle of dark, congealed fluid that had dripped from the table earlier in the night, leaving a wide, wet smear of red and black in its wake that hissed softly against the freezing stone. I wanted to scream, "Boss!" I wanted to open my mouth and let out every ounce of terror that was burning a hole straight through my chest, letting loose a primal shriek that could shatter the oppressive silence of this underground tomb. But my throat was completely locked, paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of the silence closing in around us from all sides, sealing my vocal cords in a dry, burning chokehold of absolute helplessness. The dead man's jaw hung open at that impossible, broken angle, the dark gray fluid spilling steadily down his chest and pooling into the fabric of his torn shirt, spreading an oily, suffocating stench of decay that choked my remaining senses. And right as the metal frame of the gurney slammed hard against the base of my wooden stool with a dull, echoing impact that rattled the marrow in my bones, the heavy freight elevator doors at the back of the room engaged with a definitive, mechanical locking action, sealing themselves shut from the inside with an absolute iron barrier, boss, cutting off our only escape and locking us together in the dark forever. The brutal, kinetic impact of that heavy iron freight door locking from the inside didn't just echo through the sub-basement, boss. It hit the damp, crumbling brick walls and bounced back like a physical blow, a harsh, metallic slam of cold steel hitting steel that rattled the instruments on my tray and made the concrete floor vibrate right through the soles of my heavy leather boots, sending a violent shockwave straight up into my aching spine and shattering my remaining nerves. 10 years of working this shift. 10 winters of listening to the wind howl down the coal chute and watching the ice crawl up the inside of the cellar windows. I knew every sound this building could make. I knew the groans of the water pipes, the settling of the foundation timbers, and the hollow, rhythmic clank of the freight cables 5 floors above. This wasn't the building, boss. That latch had dropped into place with the calculated, mechanical precision of a vault door sliding home in a prison block, thrown by an invisible hand standing just inches away in the absolute blackness of the elevator shaft, sealing my doom with an absolute, irrevocable finality. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My spine was still pressed flat against the rough, splintered wood of the supply crate behind me, every muscle in my back locked in a rigid, agonizing spasm, pierced by microscopic wooden splinters that tore deeper into my flesh with every trembling breath. On the gurney right in front of me, Arthur Miller's body sat up straight against the metal table. Without a single sound of warning, without any of the natural leverage a living man uses to push himself up from a flat surface, his torso rose 90 degrees into the air in one brutal, jerky motion, tearing the dead tissue apart from the inside. A rapid succession of explosive, cracking echoes filled the chamber as the stiffened vertebrae in his spine snapped like dry kindling, sending a volley of sharp echoes ricocheting off the low concrete ceiling, accompanied by the wet tearing of internal ligaments. His head remained tilted sideways at that impossible, broken angle, the dark, soot-stained beard brushing against his torn shoulder, while his milk-white, glazed eyes stared straight ahead with a flat, lifeless intensity that made my skin crawl and my blood freeze solid in my veins. And then, the wooden prosthesis on the table moved again. It didn't slide this time. It hopped. A short, heavy, mechanical twitch of the pine heel against the stainless steel that produced a sharp, hollow impact echoing against the cold surfaces, turning itself 90 degrees to face the locked elevator doors with an eerie, autonomous precision. The smell in the room changed instantly, boss. The chemical sting of the formalin and the sharp reek of vinegar completely vanished, swallowed whole by an overwhelming, suffocating stench of burning coal dust, frozen river mud, and the heavy, copper-rich reek of old, dried blood left to bake on a steam radiator, burning my nasal passages raw with its toxic intensity. The single neon tube overhead didn't just flicker now. It died. The low hum stopped abruptly, leaving behind a thick, absolute pitch blackness that felt heavy and physical, pressing against my eyeballs with actual crushing weight, blinding me completely and wiping away the boundaries of the room until the walls, the ceiling, and the concrete floor ceased to exist in the crushing void. In the dead, suffocating dark, a continuous, wet, rasping respiratory noise filled the space. It wasn't coming from me. My lungs were frozen, refusing to draw a single drop of air past my clenched teeth. It was coming from the gurney, right there in front of me, a slow, wet, rattling exhale that sounded like a pair of collapsed, ruined lungs trying to force stale air through a throat clogged with wet coal dust and dried blood, vibrating with an unnatural, sickening cadence. And then, out of the pitch-black void, a hand reached across the narrow space between the table and the crate. Ice-cold fingers, stiff and rigid like frozen wire, wrapped slowly, deliberately around my right wrist, pressing down with a cruel, unyielding, steady pressure that threatened to crush the bone beneath the fabric of my sleeve into jagged splinters, while the dead, sub-zero temperature of its skin burned away my flesh like acid, boss. The ice-cold fingers didn't just grip my wrist, boss. They locked around my bones with the unyielding, mechanical pressure of a hydraulic press, cold as glacial ice and heavy as a block of cast iron hoisted from the bottom of the Delaware River, crushing the delicate radial nerve against my forearm and sending a blinding surge of white-hot agony straight through my central nervous system. I didn't scream. My throat was too dry, burned raw by the freezing chemical fog that had settled into the corners of the cellar, locking every drop of moisture behind my clenched teeth while my windpipe constricted into an agonizing, immovable knot of absolute terror. In the absolute, pitch-black dark, where the neon tube had finally given up its ghost, I couldn't see the gurney anymore. I couldn't see the stainless steel table, or the supply crate, or the dozens of wooden limbs hanging from the damp brick walls. There was nothing left except the feel of that dead hand pressing harder, grinding my wrist bones together with a slow, agonizing friction that sent sharp lances of white-hot pain shooting straight up through my forearm and deep into my elbow joint, fracturing the cartilage with a dull, internal pop that echoed through my skull. "The shift doesn't end at dawn, boss," the voice rasped out of the dark. It wasn't echoing from the room around us anymore. It was vibrating directly inside the cavity of my chest, rattling against my ribs with the harsh, dry friction of a hand saw cutting through seasoned pine in a locked room, tearing at my heart muscle with invisible, razor-sharp talons. The dead man was standing up. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the sudden, heavy displacement of air as his weight shifted off the metal gurney, the slow, stiff, unnatural slide of frozen canvas trousers scraping against the edge of the steel table, accompanied by the revolting sound of frozen skin tearing away from the cold metal surface. A harsh, abrasive scraping sound of stiff canvas and frozen fabric sliding across the cold steel filled the void. He was standing right in front of me now in the impenetrable blackness, towering over my crouched frame against the supply crate, casting no shadow because there was no light left in the world to break, radiating a profound, absolute zero that froze the moisture right on my eyeballs. The smell of wet coal dust and frozen river mud was so thick it coated the inside of my nostrils like wet grease, making my stomach turn over in a violent, sickening wave of nausea that I swallowed back down with a bitter taste of acid, threatening to choke me from the inside out. And then, the grip on my wrist released. Not because he let go, boss. Because his cold, stiff fingers slid upward, tracing a slow, agonizing path along my forearm, past my elbow, and straight up to the collar of my canvas apron, leaving a streak of phantom ice burns that felt like boiling oil poured over raw nerves. A second hand, the one that had been resting flat against the gurney since he was wheeled down from 4th Street at midnight, reached out through the dark and grabbed the heavy iron mallet still clutched in my right fist. I tried to pull my fingers away. I tried to loosen my grip on the hickory handle. My muscles refused to obey. They were locked in a deep, bone-deep paralysis, frozen by the sheer, overwhelming terror of a man caught between the living world and the cold, wet clay of the cemetery floor, betrayed by my own trembling nervous system. The dead hand closed over mine, forcing my knuckles down, tightening my grip until the wood of the handle dug deep into my palm, splitting the skin and mixing my own warm blood with the oily decay of the corpse. And right across the cellar, near the far corner where the coal chute opened up to the freezing Philadelphia street above, a loud, hollow, resonant mechanical impact echoed through the darkness as the heavy iron latch of the second sub-basement door engaged, as if something outside was trying to find a way in, boss, sealing our inescapable trap for all eternity. The brutal, sudden impact of that second latch clicking open in the far corner of the cellar didn't echo, boss. It swallowed the air. It was a dry, hollow snap that cut right through the pitch-black silence of the sub-basement, sounding less like an iron bolt sliding back and more like a massive wooden beam cracking clean in half under the weight of an oncoming freight train, sending a violent shockwave of pure dread tearing through the frozen atmosphere, fracturing my nerves and plunging my soul into an abyss of absolute, suffocating terror. My fingers were still welded to the hickory handle of the iron mallet, trapped beneath the dead man's ice-cold, rigid grip. I couldn't feel my hand anymore. The skin had gone completely numb, drained of all blood by the crushing pressure of those stiff, frozen fingers pressing down over my knuckles, cutting off all circulation while the dead tissues radiated a sub-zero cold that felt like liquid nitrogen freezing my flesh to the wood, turning my fingers into dead, petrified with locked in a torturous grip of unyielding agony. In the absolute dark, where the single neon tube overhead remained dead and cold, the space around us felt like it was expanding, stretching out into an endless, subterranean cavern of damp brick and freezing stone that went on forever in every direction, losing all bounds of reality, swallowing my sanity whole within a limitless void of crushing darkness. A harsh, abrasive scraping sound of coarse canvas and stiff fabric dragging across the abrasive stone floor drew closer through the void. The sound of those stiff canvas trousers dragging across the concrete floor was getting closer. He wasn't standing still anymore. He was moving through the pitch-black void with a slow, mechanical regularity, each step falling with a heavy, leaden thud that made the wooden supply crate behind my back shudder against the wall, rattling the loose nails and vibrating straight up through my spine, sending agonizing spasms of electric pain through my marrow. A sequence of heavy, rhythmic impacts followed by wet, dragging slides resonated through the masonry. The smell of wet coal dust, frozen river mud, and rotting pine grew so thick and suffocating that it tasted like copper and old vinegar on the back of my tongue, making my eyes water behind my closed lids, burning the lining of my throat with an acrid, toxic vapor that choked out my remaining oxygen and filled my lungs with the corrupt stench of open graves. And then, right beside my left ear, the breathing started again. It wasn't a whisper. It was a low, rattling wheeze, pulling air through a throat packed tight with soot and grit, hot and foul despite the freezing temperature of the cellar, coating my skin in a sickening, putrid humidity that crawled over my neck like a swarm of venomous, freezing spiders. "You're running out of time on the shift, boss," the voice rasped, vibrating straight through the bones of my skull, shaking the teeth in my jaw until they clicked together in the dark, driving invisible needles of pure terror deep into my cerebral cortex, tearing apart the last fragile shreds of my mental composure. Before I could draw a breath, before my mind could find a single muscle to twitch, the dead hand clamped over mine jerked upward. My arm was wrenched away from my side with a violent, snapping force that pulled my shoulder socket out of alignment, sending a blinding flash of white-hot pain shooting straight across my chest while tendons tore and joints ground together in a sickening display of raw, anatomical violence that shattered my collarbone and left my limb dangling in a horrific, useless arc. The iron mallet was torn from my grip. A sharp, piercing crash of heavy metal striking stainless steel echoed through the chamber as the iron tool spun through the air in the absolute dark before it struck the prep table with a sharp, echoing impact that sounded like a hammer hitting a sheet of thin glass, shattering the fragile quiet of the tomb into a million razor-sharp fragments. And right as the iron implement hit the steel, a pale, sickly amber light flickered back to life from the dead neon tube overhead, casting long, distorted, writhing shadows across the room and revealing the empty gurney sitting just 3 feet away, its metal surface smeared with a fresh, wet trail of dark, congealed fluid leading straight toward the coal chute, boss, marking a path of inescapable doom from which there was no return, sealing my fate in a nightmare of endless blood and iron. The neon tube didn't just flicker back on, boss. It ignited with a violent, deafening buzz, a harsh, electrical scream of raw voltage that tore through the dead silence of the sub-basement like a jagged meat hook ripping through wet muscle, throwing a blinding, sickly amber glare across the entire room, searing my retinas with the force of a sudden, blinding flash fire that burned deep into the back of my skull and left my vision swimming in pools of blood-red haze, filling the suffocating air with the sharp, acrid reek of ozone and sparking copper wires. My eyes burned from the sudden, jarring shock of the light, watering instantly as I squeezed them shut against the searing glare, my back still jammed hard against the splintered pine of the supply crate while microscopic splinters dug deeper into my trembling flesh, piercing my skin with hot, stinging agony that set my nerves ablaze and sent tremors of pure panic rippling down my spine, threatening to burst my racing heart right through my ribs. When I forced my eyelids open a fraction of an inch, the empty gurney 3 feet away wasn't empty anymore. He was back on it. Not lying flat the way the orderlies had dropped him from 4th Street at midnight, but propped up on his stiff elbows, his heavy shoulders hunched forward toward me with a grotesque, unnatural hunch that made his torn wool jacket bunch up around his ears, distorting his skeletal frame into a nightmare of impossible, bone-crushing angles that threatened to shatter his very anatomy from within under the weight of a horrific, unholy resurrection. His milk-white, glazed eyes weren't staring at the ceiling anymore. They were locked dead on me. The pupils were completely absent, replaced by 2 cloudy, stagnant pools of yellowed glass that reflected the flickering amber light of the neon tube like dirty puddles in a rail yard, radiating an abyssal, freezing malice that froze my thoughts in place, turned my blood to slush, and sucked the remaining warmth right out of my shivering chest, leaving behind an icy vacuum of absolute despair. And the jaw, that loose, unhinged jaw dangling from his broken cervical vertebrae, swung slightly to the left with a sickening, wet friction as the heavy, soot-stained lips pulled back in a rigid, terrifying simulation of a smile, tearing the dry, frost-bitten skin at the corners of his mouth into jagged, bloody splits that oozed a thick, dark slime of coagulated corruption, dripping onto his chest with nauseating regularity. A dry, abrasive scraping sound of coarse gravel sliding down a galvanized iron chute echoed across the chamber as the voice cut through the air, vibrating violently against the damp masonry and shaking loose flakes of ancient mortar from the ceiling above. "The ledger's still open, boss," the voice scraped across the room, dry and rattling like dying breath pushed through a ruined windpipe, vibrating directly against my eardrums with an intense, agonizing frequency that brought a warm trickle of blood from my left nostril, dripping heavily onto my trembling lip with a metallic tang that made me choke on my own saliva, driving me further toward the edge of complete mental collapse. I looked down at my right hand. My fingers were curled into a stiff, permanent claw, white-knuckled and trembling so violently that the skin across my knuckles looked translucent under the harsh light, completely drained of life and warmth, locked in a violent, involuntary spasm of sheer, unadulterated horror that paralyzed every fiber of my being. The iron mallet was gone from my grip, resting now on the far edge of the stainless steel prep table right beside the pot of bubbling animal hide glue, the dark brown liquid steaming slowly as it released that thick, nauseating reek of boiled bone and vinegar, filling the air with the suffocating stench of an industrial slaughterhouse and melting flesh that burned the lining of my throat raw and made my stomach heave violently against my spine. And all around us, hanging from the rusted iron hooks along the damp brick walls, the dozens of prosthetic limbs had stopped their swaying. They were pointing. Every single carved wooden arm, every wax-coated hand, and every heavy pine foot had swung around on its leather strap with terrifying synchronization, aiming their rigid, jointed fingers directly at my chest, as if voting unanimously on who the next case down in this Philadelphia tomb was going to be, boss, locking me inside a closing circle of absolute, inescapable doom from which there was no awakening, sealing my soul within a living grave of eternal terror. The neon tube overhead didn't flicker anymore, boss. It locked into a steady, unblinking glare of harsh, amber light that washed the entire sub-basement in the color of old grease and dying tallow, stripping away every friendly shadow and leaving the damp brick walls completely bare, naked, and exposed to the chill of the Philadelphia winter, burning my skin with an unnatural, oppressive heat that froze my blood simultaneously. On the stainless steel prep table 3 feet away, Arthur Miller didn't move. He didn't drop back down onto his back. He didn't close his unblinking, milk-white eyes. He stayed propped up on his stiff, frozen elbows, his heavy shoulders hunched forward, his unhinged jaw hanging slack in that perpetual, frozen grin while a single, dark drop of congealed fluid gathered at the corner of his lip, hung there for a long, agonizing second, and fell, tearing away a thread of decayed tissue as it detached. A sharp, resonant impact of heavy liquid striking cold metal echoed through the chamber, sounding like an iron coin dropped on a tombstone. The sound hit the metal surface with a sharp, echoing ring that sounded less like a liquid dropping and more like a heavy iron coin hitting a collection plate in an empty church, sending vibrations straight through my marrow. My spine was still jammed hard against the splintered wood of the supply crate behind me. My legs felt like hollow pipes filled with lead, completely devoid of feeling from the knees down where the cellar frost had crept up through the soles of my boots, turning my lower limbs into dead, useless weights anchored to the freezing stone floor. I didn't reach for the iron mallet on the table. I didn't turn around to claw at the heavy freight elevator doors. There was nowhere left to run, boss, and the shift had stopped keeping track of the hours long before the neon tube had first started its dying buzz, trapping my soul within an endless, timeless corridor of pure torment. I looked down at my right hand. The fingers were still locked in that tight, rigid claw, white at the knuckles, stiffened by the memory of iron grip that had crushed my wrist bones just moments ago, fracturing the internal structure of my hand in a silent, lingering agony. Slowly, deliberately, I opened my palm. Nothing fell out. Nothing was there except a thin, gray smear of machine oil and wood dust cased in the lines of my skin, glowing with a faint, diseased aura under the amber light. And then, right across the room, the heavy iron coal chute in the far corner gave a long, metallic groan, tearing against its hinges in a shriek of tortured steel. A high-pitched, vibrating wail of grinding iron and torn hinges pierced the dense air as the heavy flap shifted in the dark. A fresh gust of freezing wind blew down from the South Street sidewalk above us, carrying with it the faint, distant rumble of a midnight freight locomotive passing over the iron rail bridges across the river, its horn sounding a long, mournful wail that faded slowly into the heavy winter air, carrying the phantom screams of the lost. When the rumble died away, the cellar was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes when a room is empty, boss. The kind of quiet that settles over a freshly filled grave right after the last shovel of dirt has been patted down smooth by an invisible hand, heavy and suffocating enough to crush the lungs from the outside. I blinked. Just for a single second. And when my eyes opened again under the harsh amber glare of the neon light, the stainless steel table was completely empty. The gurney was gone. The canvas sheets were folded neatly in the corner by the drain. The pot of animal hide glue on the kerosene burner had gone out, cold and dark, leaving behind a hard, amber crust of hardened resin at the bottom of the tin, exhaling a final, toxic breath of chemical decay. Only one thing remained on the table. A single, hand-carved pine prosthesis, polished with dark amber varnish, resting squarely in the center of the steel sheet with its heavy leather straps neatly folded across the instep, waiting quietly for the next pair of trousers to fill the empty space, boss, sealing my eternal damnation within the iron walls of this subterranean slaughterhouse.